By the way, while I'm clearing the decks here, I love that your presider this morning started with the greeting of Namaste. He spot on what he said. I'd like to embellish upon that and add to it by sharing with you what Mahatma Gandhi shared about the definition of Namaste. He takes it a little deeper in some regards than what you said, but has included everything you said. He said there is a place, when we go to that consciousness of Namaste, there's that place within me where the entire universe dwells. And there is that place within you where the entire universe dwells. And when you are aware of that place within you, and I am aware of that place within me, we are one. So it's saying the same thing, I think, but in perhaps a deeper way. I truly love that definition. So what I want to share with you this morning is my version of Palm Sunday. I was going to be here next week, but the calendar didn't allow it, so we're going to do my version of Palm Sunday this morning, which I know Reverend Karen will pick up on and embellish for next week. And I begin with a reading from one of my favorite books of all time by Richard Bach. And the reading is from his book Illusions. It's the beginning, it's the story of the reluctant Messiah. And this is the story that he starts the book with. Once there lived a village of creatures along the bottom of a great crystal river. The current of the river swept silently over all of them, young and old, rich and poor, good and evil, the current going its own way, only knowing its own crystal self. Each creature in its own manner clung tightly to the twigs and the rocks of the river bottom, for clinging was their way of life, and resisting the current what each had learned from birth. But one creature said at last, "I'm tired of clinging. Though I cannot see it with my eyes, I trust that the current knows where it's going. I shall let go and let it take me where it will. Clinging, I will surely die of boredom." The other creatures laughed and said, "Fool, let go, and that current you worship will throw you tumbled and smashed across the rocks, and you will die quicker than boredom." But the one heeded them not, and taking a breath, did let go, and at once was tumbled and smashed by the current across the rocks. And yet in time, as the creature refused to cling again, the current lifted him free from the bottom, and he was bruised and hurt no more. And the creatures downstream, to whom he was a stranger, cried, "See, a miracle! A creature like ourselves, yet he flies. See, the Messiah, come to save us all." And the one carried in the current said, "I am no more a Messiah than you. The river delights to lift us if only we dare let go. Our true work in this voyage, this adventure, to let go." But they cried even more, "Savior!" all the while clinging to the rocks. And they looked up again, and he was gone. And they were left alone, making legends of their Savior. Of course, if you've read any of my materials, my books, you'll know that I really believe in the power of metaphor, the power of idioms, and the power of that we learn from examples put in front of us, that we can find application in our lives today. And this story is very relevant in so many ways. The Crystal River itself is one big metaphor. The Crystal River itself is the metaphor for what? Life. Infinite intelligence, God, the presence of God flowing forward, always moving forward. And the sticks and the rocks on the riverbed that the little creatures clung to, what does that represent? It represents our fears. It represents those things that we cling and hold on to that cause us to feel separation and apart from the flow of life that knows where it's going, that wants to lift us and take it with it. But we resist that flow because we're clinging so tight to something. And so the metaphor of the story is to know that the river, infinite intelligence, The Crystal River knows where it's going. And it is ours to trust enough to know that we are one with the river, to let go of those things we cling to that keep us separated and apart from the forward movement of life, of that infinite intelligence that knows what it is doing and where it is going. So this story literally is the story of the evolution of the soul. Ernest Holmes referred to it as the lesser giving way to the greater. To the degree that the lesser, meaning the human self, the egoic self, can surrender its attachment to those rocks and twigs at the bottom of the river, the lesser surrenders to the greater, and we're lifted into a flow of life that knows no parallel. And the practice that I think Ernest Holmes is referring to, that this story refers to, is divine surrender. The practice of letting go of whatever we cling to that keeps us from being lifted into that greater flow of God's abundant life. Always moving forward. And so today I'm going to invite you to take a look at the rocks, the twigs, that maybe you brought in here this morning that you're clinging to, that can represent your resistance to the forward flow of life. And of course, there's no better story at all and no better time to talk about this than Palm Sunday, which of course is next week. Palm Sunday, we have to understand something. I was blessed to have one of the greatest New Thought teachers of scriptures in New Thought, William Curtis. William Curtis taught me a lot about understanding the necessity of understanding the metaphor and the idioms and the philosophy of a book written thousands of years ago by Semitic people. We have to understand the metaphor of the Bible in order to draw the value from it. And the point that in New Thought, when we look at the Scriptures, we have to understand that every story in the Scriptures, every character represents some aspect of our own being. Every character represents some aspect of our own being. Both the characters we like and the ones that maybe we don't like so much. And so to understand that when we look at the Scriptures through understanding it is our story, then we can draw value and meaning from it in a way that is applicable in our lives today. And of course, the best place to start with that for Palm Sunday is in the Garden of Gethsemane. It itself is a wonderful metaphor. In New Thought, we look at Jesus, the great teacher Jesus, as not the great exception, but the great example. And it was in the Garden of Gethsemane where the great teacher was given the opportunity to reconcile his humanness with his divinity. To reconcile that physical, fleshy part of him that was so married to the human condition with that part of him that knew he was more than the shell that he lived in. The spiritual essence of the Christ presence, if you will. And the greatest example of this is in the Garden of Gethsemane is when the lesser gave way to the greater. It's the greatest story, I think, in the entire New Testament. Gethsemane comes from the word oil press. It means oil press. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane was located on Mount Olive. And it wasn't a mountain in literal terms, but it was a big hill. And it was a place where they grew olives. And the Garden of Gethsemane is where they had the oil press, where they would take the olives and put them in the press and squeeze the precious oils from the olive and discard the husk, the shell, that which is the lower. It's a beautiful metaphor of understanding that as we enter into a level of living where we allow ourselves to dance that divine dance between the physical and the spiritual, and allow the essence of the divine in that moment. And oftentimes it's in a moment of crisis. Has anybody here ever been in a moment of crisis? 3 of us. And And at that moment, did you recall how, if you were conscious, you began to remember, to come back to the awareness of your oneness with God? And so that's metaphorically in drawing the essence of the Christ self, if you will, out of the human experience. So the story depicts the battle between Jesus, the battle that Jesus was having between his humanity and his divinity. Now, here's the question. Have any of you ever had that battle? Where the human kind of was struggling with the realization of that greater part of you that knew what it was, what it came here to do, but was resisting doing it because the human was struggling so much to hold on to the condition, the ego, whatever it is in the human, at the human level, that would keep us from ascending in consciousness to a higher level of consciousness. You know, the story has so many metaphors, it's amazing. It depicts the humanity of Jesus and his ability to ascend or transcend that. It is written in Luke 22:44 that Jesus literally was so enmeshed in fear in the Garden of Gethsemane that he sweat or perspired tears of blood. Now that is an idiom. What does that mean? It's an idiom which means he was scared spitless in that moment because he knew what was coming. He planned it. But he was also aware that he had to go through his own, the unfoldment of his own plan. And to ensure himself that he would be able to follow through with the plan. You see, without the Garden of Gethsemane, without betrayal, there could be no Easter, no resurrection. And he knew that he had to go through this in order to demonstrate eternal life. And so what did he do? He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. Who does he bring with him? Peter, James, and John, the Zebedee brothers. Peter and the Zebedee brothers, okay? And so he brings these guys with him to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, I'm going to go up the hill and pray. And you guys, I want you to stay down here and stand guard. Keep watch, he said. Keep watch. Now, what do you think he meant by keep watch? Do you think he meant keep watch for strangers approaching? No, he knew that was happening. He knew that was going to happen. He was enrolling Peter, James, and John as his prayer partners to hold the high watch for me while I go up, while I ascend this mountain, this hill, which is a metaphor for rising in consciousness, where I can have a conversation with my Father, with God. And your job is to stay down here and keep watch. So he goes up to the top of the hill. A stone's throw away, they say, which far, pretty good distance. And he falls to his knees. And in that moment, he says, Father, if it be thy will, pass this cup from my lips. But nonetheless, thy will be done. So he comes back down the hill. And what does he find? The three boys sleeping. So he wakes them up. He says, you guys need to stay awake, stand watch, while I go back up the hill. I'm going to pray again. So he goes back up the hill. Again, Father, if it be thy will, pass this cup from my lips. It's written. It does this 3 times. Comes back down the hill. What's going on? The guys are sleeping again. Now, this metaphorically means, it symbolizes the lower self. It's hard to stay awake when you're trying to bring forward the awareness of the Christ presence. The human self wants to go to sleep. So what does he say? He wakes him up and he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Can you relate to that? The flesh meaning that human condition, that part of us that lives in the realm of the human condition where there's all kinds of obstacles and things that distract us from that place within us that knows it's calling, that we're being called to ascend to a higher level of awareness of who we are and what we came here to do. So he goes up the hill the third time, comes back down. And each time he comes down, he realizes there's more prayer to do. He comes down, goes up, comes down, goes up 3 times. Gives it up to God, comes back down into the human realm, human consciousness. Goes back up, gives it back to God, takes it back. Now, how many of you have ascended in prayer and given up to God some issue, some condition, something that was weighing heavily upon you, only to go back into the human condition, your daily life, and take it back? 3 or 4 of it, 5 of us, okay. See, that is the metaphor of this beautiful story, that there's this part of us that wants to sleep because it doesn't want us to awaken to the possibilities that come with the Christ consciousness arising within us. And that's the battle that Jesus went through in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that is what Palm Sunday is all about. Perhaps we need to know more fully what Jesus knew, intuitively knew. No, the word no comes from Gnostic, gnosis. What that means literal translation is gnosis or Gnostic is the knowledge of transcendence arrived at by way of interior, intuitive awareness. In other words, you'll never receive that guidance from someplace outside of yourself. But when you're awake to the Christ presence, that Namaste, I and the Father are one, there's only one of us here. When we're awake to that presence, that knowing seems to arise from within ourselves, and it guides us, it supports us, it lifts us into its flow and peace. Transcendence of our problems happens through self, capital S, knowing or remembering. How much time each day do we take to know, go into gnosis, to access that intuitive place within and allow ourselves to dwell in the presence of the Father? Some of us do it once a morning. Some of us do it once a week. Some of us wait until we're in the garden and there's a problem, and then we start praying. Of course, I've always thought that we're much better off if we spend time daily grooming a consciousness of the awareness of God's presence at all times, because it's better to know where the fire extinguisher lies in our lives before the fire happens, right? And if we're staying anchored each day in the awareness of the presence of God, when that crisis does happen, we know right where to go. I and the Father are one. So simple. And yet so hard. How are you breathing? You see, it was in the garden that Jesus had a redefining moment. He remembered who he was. And you know what? Once we remember, we come back to the truth. Once we remember who we are, it doesn't matter what other people have to say about us, because we're anchored in knowing the truth. He stood before Pilate the next day. And Pilate says, so, they say you're the king of the Jews. Are you? And what was Jesus' comment? His reply was so exquisite. He says, here's it all. He says, it is as you say. In other words, He didn't go think about it and go, well, yeah, I am the king of the Jews, or yes, I'm the king of the Jews, or he didn't deny it. All he said was, it's as you say. Isn't that the great law? It is done unto you as you believe. It is as you say. If you perceive me as such and such, that's your experience of me. But that doesn't mean that it's my truth of what you're perceiving. What did Terry Whitaker say? What you think of me is none of my business. So, Pilate's opinion didn't matter because he was already anchored in the truth of who he was. He was purified in the Garden of Gethsemane because the lower gave way to the upper, the higher. he was able in that moment to surrender to the truth and stay in that truth. And from that moment forward, read the story. He does not enter into fear or angst. He still suffered physical pain, but he did not go back into the human condition because the Christ had ascended within him. But there's the beautiful story, and here's the point. If we can't find personal application in every story in the Scriptures or anything that we read that is of a teaching mode, if we can't find personal relevance and application in it for ourselves, what good is it? It's no good at all. And so Palm Sunday, while it's next week, you can enter the consciousness of Palm Sunday this week. It's our story. Every character in that story is you, is me. Peter, James, John, though that human fleshy part of us that falls asleep and it really resists standing guard and standing watch and creating that space for the Christ presence to be revealed. Pilate, the judgmental one, who's always casting the question rather than knowing the answer. Jesus himself. So, if Palm Sunday is our story, we've all spent time in our own personal Garden of Gethsemane. There's nothing saying you have to be crucified in order to have a resurrection. Some of us, our Garden of Gethsemane might be found in the conflict of the challenge of a physical health issue. Or our Garden of Gethsemane might be a relationship crisis. Our Garden of Gethsemane might be a place where we are in conflict with losing our place of employment or our financial status. Any place where we find that wailing and gnashing of teeth, as it says, where we feel pulled apart and drawn away from the awareness of our oneness with God's source. Can you identify any place in your life where you may be dwelling in the Garden of Gethsemane for yourself? I can. I can. I guess that's because I still haven't ascended to a point where I live in the presence of Christ awareness, the Christ presence 24/7. I'm working on it. The practice, and here's the takeaway. The practice is understanding the power of divine surrender. Not just when problems arise, but every moment of every day. Not my will, Father, but thine. Divine surrender isn't, I give up. It's, I give up. I know that I am one with the power that is greater than me, that knows what to do in order to lift me and move me out of this, one way or another. And so the quintessential, if the mantra is not my will, Father, but thine, what is God's will for you? What is God's will for each of us? You may be able to personalize this and see where it applies in your life in a specific way. But as my understanding and my belief, and I think Ernest Holmes had the same belief, that God's will, only God's will, is to find a place in your life, to create a larger place in your life where it may have its way by moving in you and through you and unfolding as your life. Wow. That's heavy. In other words, God's will is to find a greater place in your life for fullness of expression. Inner peace, reverence, unconditional love, forgiveness, detachment. That's what detachment is. What allowed the little critters on the bottom, the one that let go. He had to be detached from the fear of what lie downstream. Take a breath. If God only seeks a larger part of your life through which it may reveal more of its own divinity in our humanity, which I think is the point of the story, where in your life today would you be willing to say, not my will, Father, but thine? In the process, we may have to make peace with the fact that something we have been clinging to must be released. Something. Could be a thing, could be a fear, could be a resentment, could be a worry. Something has to be let go of for the lesser to give way to the greater. That's the message. That is the story. So I'm going to close with a song. And I invite you to come into the garden and sit with me. If you can imagine, if you will, that this is my thought, my belief, my idea of the teacher sitting in the garden in that moment of surrender. It's called my dedication. Here I am, Lord. Use me. Guide me. Fill me. Take me. Lead me by your will. Here I am, Lord, ready to follow, to serve you, to love you, to be you in this world. Thy will is done through me this day. Thy will is done through me this day. Lord, you call, I answer, I'm open, I listen, I hear you, I feel you move in me. Lord, I come closer, humbled, surrendered, lifted, committed to your plan. Thy will is done through me this day. Thy will is done through me this day. Here I am, Lord, I come. Here I am, Lord, I come. So it is. Thank you.